Welcome, everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. And it's my great pleasure to host today's event. I will be in conversation with Dr. Fadi Saleh, and we'll be talking on Refugeeness, humanitarianism, and the politics of writing Syrian queer and trans histories. The event today is supported by the Herbert Goldberger Lectureship Fund, and it's part of an annual series on queering the Middle East and its diaspora, which the Center for Middle East Studies is hosting this year. So over the last years, the Syrian Uprisings of March 2011, there has been an unprecedented global interest in and proliferation of representations of Syrian queer and trans populations. And they became primarily known and represented through the framework of being LGBT refugees that are seeking humanitarian protection and asylum. Now, in this conversation, we will be exploring the politics and problems with these very hegemonic representations of Syrian LGBT communities and queer and trans life in Syria. And so let me introduce Dr. Fadi Saleh to you. Hello, Fadi. Dr. Fadi Saleh holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Göttingen in Germany. His research and teaching focus on queer and trans issues from a transnational perspective, with special attention to migration, humanitarianism, and the politics of representation and knowledge production in the Middle East and North Africa. Outside of academia, he has worked in different civil society, human rights, and LGBTIQ organizations and institutions across the MENA region and also in Europe. Has been involved in various training, consultancy, advocacy, and activist capacity. So hello, Fadi. Welcome. I'm so happy you can join us. So I thought, I should say, so Fadi and I will be in conversation for a while, maybe 30, 40 minutes, but you're welcome to ask questions and comments, and please put them in the Q&A function of the webinar. And hopefully we'll have time to get to them. We will have time, we make time. So Fadi, maybe just start out with, can you tell us about your research on Syrian refugees? How has this developed over the years? And what kind of questions did you originally pursue, and how has that evolved?
Well, thank you so much, Nadia, for your kind introduction and for having me here today in conversation with you. I'm very excited to be here. And maybe to start off, with talking a little bit about my research. Very, very originally, I think around 2013, I actually started thinking about my PhD research project with asking a somewhat different kind of question from the one I asked later. So the question of how it evolves over time is much appreciated. Because in 2013, looking at the state of LGBT activism in the Middle East, North Africa in general, and being in those kinds of circles and following with a lot of the discourses and the representations and the writings on LGBT issues across the MENA region in general, for some reason, I couldn't stop myself from asking, what are Middle East and North African queer and trans people when they're not suffering? And, that kind of question, thinking about Syria 3 years after, 2 years into the conflict, around 2013, I was thinking the same, what are Syrian LGBT people doing when they're not suffering? I mean, I'm guessing the question points to an observation that I started to think about and to make regarding the type of knowledge and the type of representation and type of writing that makes it to the mainstream, especially in Western contexts, and when we write about or talk about LGBTIQ issues and lives and histories in the Middle East and North Africa. And so, of course, in 2013, 2014, I started thinking more about Syria. 2014 and 2015, if you think back in time, Daesh emerged at the time. 2015, we had the so-called summer of migration and the so-called refugee crisis. And it was during that time that one witnessed a massive, unprecedented explosion of writings and representations and images and videos of Syrian LGBT refugees specifically. Of course, this was also the result of, migration. There was more migration and there was more movement of LGBTIQ people from Syria into its neighboring countries. So starting 2013, I also started to follow the journeys of some of my friends and acquaintances in Syria who decided to leave at some point and to go to neighboring countries, more specifically to Turkey in my case, in order to seek asylum through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Resettlement program. And so all good so far, like 2013, 2014, started following some of my friends' journeys and, following their asylum processes. But what I noticed at the time was, I started to make a few general observations just by following what was happening, not only in terms of, Daesh and summer of migration and the explosion of representations. I noticed a parallel development from talking to my friends, interlocutors, informants, call them what you will, was that a lot of the ways that they started to also speak about themselves, about what it means to be a Syrian LGBTIQ people, a lot of the ways they started to narrate their lives back in Syria, their histories back in Syria, the ways that they started to articulate what gender meant to them, what sexuality meant to them, what being LGBT meant to them, started to resemble a lot the discourses that were circulating at the time. So, talking about the media frenzy over Syrian LGBTIQ people, all of those headlines that go, this is what it means to be an LGBTIQ Syrian. This is how it's always been to be an LGBTIQ person from Syria. So a lot of those, generalized kind of notions or information about what it supposedly means, to have lived as a queer or trans person in Syria. I noticed that a lot of that was being adopted, circulated by Syrian LGBTIQ refugees themselves. And at that time, of course, I started thinking, okay, so what's happening here? Also as a person, who was Syrian gay from the community who lived also prior to 2010 within the Syrian LGBTIQ communities in Syria, I was in that position of thinking, okay, so what is exactly happening here? Of course, this is not to say there was no suffering in Syria, for LGBTIQ people. What I'm trying to get at, what I did get at in my research was to see how even their narratives of what their suffering looked like accommodate a lot of those, circulated mainstream kind of hegemonic Western narratives and ideas, humanitarian discourses of how they suffered. So, by that I mean there was a lot of filtering happening of a lot of contextual information. There was a lot of sieving out of any any information that might threaten their cases or that might make their narratives become, so to speak, queer, different, too unintelligible and too unrelatable to, say, decision makers in the asylum processes, or journalists who were interviewing them at the time, or migration and humanitarian institutions as well. So there, I decided, okay, maybe I should go and do some field work. So I did between 2014, 2015, ethnographic field work in Istanbul specifically, in order to, of course, not just to focus on the administrative or the bureaucratic aspects of the process of seeking asylum, or to also look at, the ways a lot of Western notions of proper queerness with gender and sexuality and or LGBTIQ identities are supposed to be like, and how these are enforced. Of course, this is all important work that has been done a lot, my main interest in my work was to see, okay, first, how did we go from being a population, LGBTIQ Syrians, who were quite unknown and quite irrelevant prior to 2010, into becoming extremely knowable, extremely recognizable as a constituency and as a group identity? How did this shift happen? Through which, discourses do Syrian LGBTIQ or are Syrian LGBTIQ refugees now represented or represent themselves as well? And what does that mean, of course, for the larger project of writing or queering the Middle East, writing queer and trans histories in the region? How did subjectivities change? How did their subject positions change? How did their narratives of what it meant for them to live as LGBTIQ people in Syria, how did that change through the process of migration and through their encounter with the humanitarian asylum complex, so to speak?
Yeah, that is really super interesting. And I have to say that although I did a very different kind of research in the past, a lot of what you say about this, it's a wider issue, wider question, I think. And when you do anthropological research and you try to especially look at history and, the relationship between experience, oral history, and what actually happened and the present. So in, my work on sort of life stories and oral histories of Iraqi women trying to sort of cobble together history of gendered life under the Ba'ath regime, I found that the women's stories and the sort of narration of the experience was so much shaped by their investment in the present and also the future, and of course the politics of it. And the politics in that context were kind of sectarian struggle over resources and so on. And so I'm, very intrigued by sort of the wider methodological issue that is sort of undergirding some of this, which is, how do we, as anthropologists, what are some of the ethical and methodological dilemmas we are facing, when we're actually taking experience seriously, if we don't just, look at people as, sort of objects or resources of data, but, really think, about their knowledge and experience as important contributions to knowledge production without taking things at face value, that kind of tension. So I was wondering if you could sort of reflect a little bit on the ethical and methodological challenges that you have been facing in your research.
Yes, I mean, that's clearly, if we're talking about LGBTIQ refugees, actually, during 2014, 2015, seeking asylum, me doing field work while they are in the middle of that process, and, wanting to produce knowledge about, like me saying, hey, the way you're framing things sounds a bit unfamiliar. The way you're, they're forced or they're framing things sounds, not exactly like how we know things. The way they're framing things in certain contexts, say in their interview or while they're applying or when they're talking to a journalist, is quite different from the way we talk in the safety of our own rooms, when I was in Istanbul, and when we would talk more as just friends and people who know each other, rather than, as somebody who holds, in that sense, at least at that time, so much power that would decide over their sort of livelihoods, like their chances at being resettled were how do you say that, were, would be endangered in that sense, depending on how one frames, what they're talking about, and how one frames that kind of knowledge that one is getting from the LGBTIQ refugees in Istanbul at the time. So of course there were a lot of ethical considerations there, and their main considerations. And here I'm reporting on a couple of the things that they would say. For example, it was all about, as you also just said, there was always all that talk about our way of narrating things now is an investment in the present. We don't really care about at that point framing things more authentically. We're more invested in the future. This is, if this is what it takes to be resettled, and if this is what it takes to be intelligible, it is also your job as a researcher to frame, your questions, or frame the way you approach the whole topic quite differently. And to be honest, I mean, originally I did think, I want to tell the world about all the happy things we had, or they had, when we were living our lives in Syria. And that completely just changed during fieldwork, where I was just thinking, does that really matter at this point? Is this important? Do I even have the tools, the means? Do they have the energy as the actual, collaborators in that project? How much does that matter to them? So a lot of my informants would say, or actually everyone whose names have been published so far in articles, would say, for now, why don't you tackle the issue from a different perspective? And you can publish a lot of the things that we've talked about now once we've been resettled. Like they give you a timeline saying, okay, that's one of their major ethical considerations of, just do it when we're safe. And it's a bit frustrating, of course, and saddening to think, that one would clearly just say, that me speaking in a more complex manner or more nuanced manner about my life, which again does not make anybody a person with less suffering, behind them, not at all. Quite the opposite. It just makes sometimes in a lot of the situations, like my problem was people don't always know how to narrate their suffering properly. People don't always know which suffering narratives actually make sense to decision makers and which suffering narratives don't make sense to the decision makers. So I started looking at the project from that perspective, also to point out the faults, within the larger humanitarian and asylum systems at the time. So that would be like one of the main ethical concerns. And the other, of course, other concerns would also be, I don't want to say how to represent, more authentically, so to speak, but there was always this difficulty of being able to tell all the stories that one, really wants to tell, but how do you navigate also, wanting to be more nuanced while also knowing that you can't really share all that you have. That also, became a question over and over again. Apart from questions, of course, translation and language, apart from questions of exposing people, to danger, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, those were some of the main ethical concerns that I could think of. Now, of course, we could talk more about this.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing those. I mean, listening to you, I mean, it sounds to me, when you think about, I mean, I can imagine the different narratives of suffering. Clearly, these are sort of intersectional sufferings as well, right? So I was wondering, how did you navigate that, and how did, I guess, the people you talk to navigate that? Because, they're suffering as queer refugees is the one that, well, they kind of had to emphasize in order to get asylum, because that was, intelligible to humanitarian organizations and governments in Western countries, certainly in the German context. But, there's other suffering linked to clearly political repression, I guess, class, sectarian tensions. So how did that play out in the narratives, and how did you deal with those intersectional narratives of suffering, or were they not intersectional?
I mean, needless to say, that was the whole problem.
Yes, exactly,
a lot of the narratives that one has to offer are, are like a single kind of identity narratives. So in a sense, LGBTIQ refugees from Syria would have to cut off, any other narratives that potentially, or that have potentially shaped the way they think of their queerness, that have potentially shaped the way they think of their gender identity, that have that have potentially shaped the way they think of their sexual orientation or sexual identities. So anything that might, sort of complicate that would have to be left out. And some of the things you've mentioned, for example, of course, in Syria, we don't only speak about LGBTIQ people, but of course we do think, how is it like in Aleppo, and how is it like in Latakia, what is the demographic there, and how is a Sunni gay person live differently from an Alawite gay person? How does a Sunni trans woman living in Aleppo live differently, navigate the world differently from maybe an upper class gender nonconforming person and the luxurious suburbs of Damascus? So of course, and again, I mean, that's to say, the point is not to say, hey, they didn't suffer, but a lot of people, when they think of their suffering, of course, they think in these terms, and those by default, in what we think of as intersectional terms, by default, that their not religious background affected that, class, positioning, the street where they lived, and other factors that don't always play a role clearly, in mainstream narratives around LGBTIQ Syrians. And so, of course, the problem was some LGBTIQ refugees who succeed, they have to learn. Let's say first of all, a lot of people have had to learn, what makes sense in Western narratives, what makes sense for decision makers. What do humanitarian discourses tell us about how, gender and sexuality, or gender sexual persecution based on sexual orientation, gender identity must be narrated like? And of course, it's a lot of work. It's very interesting, of course, to think, like how identities in that sense are also actively being constructed, as they go along. Also sometimes at some point internalized, compulsively even, with a lot of affect and a lot of, attachment to those new notions that one is learning, because unless you're extremely attached to what you're saying, you might risk letting a sentence or two slip that don't make sense. And of course, it happened all the time that somebody would go to an interview, would, call me later, or would be crying on the phone and would say something like, God, I mentioned this and that, and I don't think it made sense to them. I think, they thought this is very weird, or this is very strange, or how did this actually, how is this part of how you narrate your queerness, or how is this part of how you narrate your gender identity? And so to a lot of people, the risk was real. And of course, some people's cases were suspended, were indefinitely pending. They were not granted asylum. Some people are still stuck because of, the complexities of having to navigate that kind of, how do we simplify our intersectional narratives in ways that don't hurt us.
Yeah. I mean, another challenge you seem to be facing, and that you're kind of holding, another tension that I see in your work and your writing is, so on the one side, not challenging, but I would say complicating, nuancing the narratives and pointing to the way that, there is a sort of correspondence between the hegemonic humanitarian discourse and how queer refugees narrate themselves. And so there's that. But then you have, I guess, sort of mainstream literature on Syria, whether academic histories and sort of contemporary analysis, and also media that are totally blind to issues of gender and sexuality and heteronormative to the extreme, right? So in one of your articles, you asked the question, I think a very poignant question: how are we to prioritize gender and sexuality within the current political, social, and cultural agendas, and not just as late addendums or new phenomena, but as part, and as you say, as part and parcel of Syrian history before, during, and after the revolution and the ongoing conflict. So that's really important question. So how would an alternative Syrian archive look if it considered the experiences, stories, opinions, analysis, and approaches of LGBTQI Syrians in Syria and the diaspora? So how do you actually answer these questions? I mean, I know you're trying to do that through your work, through your writing, but can you explain a bit more?
Primarily, of course, and the most obvious answer is through ethnography. And I don't say that just to be like, anthropology is great and that's the solution to absolutely everything. But within, it's really sad and somewhat frustrating, of course, to see that within the last 11 years or even earlier, there's for some of us, say researchers with a certain access to privilege, with a certain access to mobility, with a certain access to resources or to language, I think a lot more ethnographic research that centralizes the personal narratives of people we know, or people, in communities that we're part of, acquaintances, or people that, we might get to know as well. I think centralizing these kinds of narratives is very, very, very important, because a lot of the work on Syria, a lot of it is, either it's very media related, for example. A lot of it, doesn't it simplifies a lot of the categories that, in terms of when we study migration and when we study asylum and when we study the diaspora, there are lots of assumptions on which a lot of the research is built, like our understanding of, or a lot of knowledge production out there, understanding of what a man is, what woman is, how gender, functions in the Syrian context, still builds a lot, on very heteronormative logics, and approaches, and asks questions in a certain way that automatically, of course, exclude certain populations, from their narratives, or from archiving, or doing archival work, so to speak, on Syria and Syrian history and Syrian society and Syrian culture, of course. So, in that sense, I think ethnographic work that is more like, what's the word? Speaking to people on eye level, being able to create certain spaces where people don't feel forced to speak in certain ways because of certain circumstances that they're going through. Like, it's a very difficult kind of task, but I think it is a very, very important and central task, and I think that's the first thing I could think of that we need to do more of, for sure. I would also talk about a little bit like autoethnography, and I know, like, in anthropology, there's, of course, a lot of questions around autoethnography, and a lot of dismissal of it sometimes, in certain strands of queer studies or anthropology itself, or trans studies, sometimes because of, certain ethical considerations, but, dismissing it to court and just thinking, autoethnography is not as good as ethnography for certain people, or for certain populations from certain countries that were actually never the object, so to speak, of anthropological research or of ethnographic research. for various reasons is not very productive. And so in that sense, in my work, I allowed myself, and I always encourage people, and researchers to reflect on their own experiences as LGBTIQ people within the community. But this, of course, it's a very, eventually, for better or for worse, I feel awkward saying it's a valuable source of information as well. So I also do that. But last but not least, more recently, I personally, started to think, okay, we should also try to intervene, forget about academia a little bit, and let's try to intervene more in, the cultural production and media sectors within Syrian civil society. Of course, there isn't one single LGBTIQ organization for like Syrian LGBTIQ organization, neither in Syria nor in Syria, not in Syria anyways, but in the diaspora, most media outlets out there and civil society organizations really still, do not include queer perspective, trans people in the way they frame, their approaches to Syria, the way they see things, the way they look at, as I said earlier, any number of phenomena that is relevant to their work. And more recently, I, for example, did this Syrian LGBT file with Syria Untold, which is like a media outlet that actually writes, invites people to write a lot about Syria, historicize, archive. We called it Queerness and the Revolution, and we're creating the resources for Syrian LGBTIQ people to actually intervene in the narrative, to actually write like their own stories. However, not to say that to write their own stories, because I also don't like that kind of formulation, because it's also extremely mainstream. And that's the last thing I will say about this, I was quite probably even a bit imposing in trying to say in the concept note in my discussions with the authors to say, try to make your experience as unfamiliar as possible. Try to make it as unfamiliar, as strange to whoever audience, which is a lot of the time just a very Western audience, that tells us how to write about ourselves, as possible. Give me the name of the school that you went to. Give me the names of the streets that absolutely nobody cares about and nobody thinks it's important to you narrating your LGBTIQ experience. So I'll stop there. Yes, I mean, these are some of the ways,
Yeah, thank you. So I guess sort of following up on this, I'm thinking also, kind of a little bit selfishly, because I'm teaching a new course on, for me, a new course on gendering, migration, and diasporas. And so one lens we're exploring and trying to work on is that of a queer perspective on migration and diaspora. Introduce a feminist perspective, a queer perspective, and I guess sort of, maybe following up, but maybe more broadly beyond your specific research, what does queering migration and diasporas mean to you? What would it entail?
Beyond my own research, definitely, just to start with, of course, a lot of people, when they think queering migration and queering diaspora, we think, we should look at LGBTIQ populations, look at all those queer and trans experiences of, migration and of being in the diaspora. That's a given. Of course, that as many queer migration scholars also, say Martin Menelanson or Etna Lubeid, I think, they also argue that, and I follow their line of argumentation, that we need, queering migration, queering diaspora also means queering the very methods and the very methodologies and the very assumptions through which migration studies and diaspora studies have functioned up till now. So that also means, not questioning our own understandings of what home means, of what, movement means, of what being in limbo means, of what, the diasporic imaginings of community in terms of also like queerness or otherwise also mean? Maybe in my own work or from my own research, it was always important to think that when we're looking at migration, not to think of an A to B kind of route. When I think of queering migration, I always try to think, like things are always in the middle. So when I talk about Syrian LGBTIQ people back home, or when they were still in Syria and when we were still in Syria, I never assumed that was some closed off kind of very well defined and authentic or local, untainted by the supernatural forces of globalization. But I always thought, okay, I'm thinking of queer migration, I always have to think, where do we stay as locals, in terms of how we imagine a migration route? How does this migration route always say Syria, Turkey, Europe, or Syria, Turkey, resettlement through UNHCR to some other Western country? I think when queering migration and diaspora, I also think, what other routes of migration, are imaginable, what other routes do also LGBTIQ people or other people take, because we're excessively stuck on always thinking, like east to west kind of movement. That is not always very productive, and everything else becomes an exception to that kind of route that a lot of Western narratives want to convince us that this is the one and only way of tracing migration, thinking of how diaspora comes about. So yeah, some of the things just come to mind.
Yeah. Thank you. So before I'm going to ask the next question, Fadi, I'm going to invite the audience again. If you have any questions or comments, I see there's one question that came up, so I'll turn to that, but I'll just ask one question that sort of follows up on what you just said, which is, so, when you think about queer theory, queer theory sort of historically has very much emanated in a kind of Anglo-Saxon, I guess, sort of originally sort of US context, and it was not initially intersectional at all. And then you have the queer of color critique, which sort of pointed to the importance of intersectionality. But still, I mean, even sort of queer of color in many ways has stayed often quite ethnocentric, often US-centric, but also, I guess, Eurocentric. And then, often when I think sort of initial work on the Middle East, it was, as others have already mentioned, so the Middle East as a kind of pool or source for data, but not for knowledge production and sort of also theory production, right? But that is changing recently, and people working on the Middle East, from the Middle East, and also the diasporas are challenging also the way that even queer of color theory has been developing. And so I guess I'd like to maybe ask you to reflect a little bit on your take on queer theory and sort of what what works for you, what doesn't, what you think your work and those of other scholars from and on the Middle East and the diaspora, what they contribute, especially in relation to Middle East studies.
That's a very loaded question. And a very difficult one to answer very quickly. I mean, of course, we love and stand some queer theory. That's as an analytical and methodological lens, and nowadays there's no escaping just resorting to it, because it helps us understand processes of normalization, how normative structures come around, how identities are not just natural and given and stable, but are always historically contingent, socially constructed, and how, of course, gender and sexuality are always inflected, by like any number of factors, other identity categories, power dynamics. Of course, while at the same time, keeping that space open, for like all those cracks and gaps and then moments of tension and fissures, through which, queerness also maintains that kind of open-endedness that also, keeps us a bit hopeful. When I think of Jose Munoz, articulation of hope, queerness is, and then as within hope, or as hope. So of course I rely a lot on that. I love how, also queer as a lens helps us, goes beyond just queerness or queer, and travels across disciplines. So helps us also look at, what anthropology does, what migration studies, what Middle Eastern studies, how can we queer how things are done in these different disciplines. And so in that sense, of course, very indebted to queer theory. However, of course, I always have like some of my little problems, as I guess many of us do, sometimes with how queer theory, especially in the U.S. American, of course, in European contexts, remains to be done. And so, for example, I always have like my tensions with queer theory's hyper focus on anti-normativity and framing it always as resistant or as resilient or as something that is always good. Because that, reflecting from my work, I can't stop thinking, that's very frustrating, because of course, first, what counts is normative, in the US context does not necessarily count as normative in other contexts. So that, begs the question, okay, what is exactly anti-normative? And second, of course, I keep on thinking, being anti-normative doesn't always, equal being resistant and empowered, because, I think of all of the Syrian LGBTIQ refugees who, for example, did not, who were anti-normative in their articulations of their gender and sexuality during their asylum interview. One would say, oh, this person was very resistant. And I would say, well, this person just feels miserable and wishes they were normative in that very moment, and that they did not actually make that kind of mistake. So how do we read these kinds of moments outside of constantly celebrating heteronormativity as if we always knew what that actually is, and almost feels sometimes too abstract to work in other places? And I have a problem with that. Maybe a very quick note on queer negativity also, like the antisocial turn and this recent valorization and celebration of queer negativity and the negative affects, and wanting to resist sometimes this more mainstream kind of LGBT happiness culture in the West, which led a lot of queer theorists to celebrate, want to revive negative affects and negative emotions and feelings, something that we need to always sustain and reclaim. And a lot of those theorizations are absolutely great, but a lot of it also feels somewhat detached from what's happening around the world, because I keep on thinking, what Jose Munoz calls this romancing the negative in queer theorizations, and but this kind of new push for queer negativity, neglects how it functions in other places, neglects the fact that humanitarian industries are neoliberal capitalist humanitarian industries are built on queer negativity, are built on sustaining those kinds of narratives, on sustaining the conditions that lead to a lot of that queer negativity. There's, as Sarah Ahmed says, a global market of suffering that cannot just be neglected also within queer theorization. So maybe I'll stop there because already
Yes. So thanks a lot, Fadi. So I'm going to turn to the questions. If it's okay, I'm going to read out a couple. So Keegan Tarek says, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Could you, Dr. Saleh, tell us more about how the hegemonic narratives you critique, which focus disproportionately on the suffering of queer Syrians, materially affect queer Syrians' lives? Or to ask the question slightly differently, what might queer Syrians stand to gain if organizations like UNHCR gave more attention to the nuance of their personal histories? And then I'm going to ask the next one as well, because actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to read them all out because they're somewhat linked, right?
Sure.
And then I have the next question by Vikramaditya Sahai. Would it be useful to think about the newer subjectivities that arise in the encounter with humanitarianism as not only resembling a global queer persecution imagery, but also the difficulty to speaking in the national as Syrian, which disappears exactly the many unfamiliars that you solicit in your curation? Because when we talk as national subjects, then structures of political regimes, law, media take on from alien to the everyday unfamiliar. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. And then we have Anel Janine, who says, in order to summarize what we have to keep in mind, what are the majors and specific issues queer Syrians have to face compared to the rest of LGBTQIA community in the world?
And okay, there's one more question.
Yeah, there's one more question. Okay, yes. Okay, so that's going in a quite different direction. So maybe we'll see if you have, yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for these questions. Amazing. I'll try to keep it as, concise, as short as possible. So first question, what might queer Syrians stand to gain if organizations like UNHCR give more attention to the nuance of their personal histories? Absolutely everything. And to start with, more people would be resettled. More people would not, have to constantly freak out about whether what they're going to say will allow them to be resettled or not resettled. And to give a very, very concrete example, for example, say one of my interlocutors goes and talks about their experiences as a queer person in Syria, and once they do mention that they were kidnapped by a faction of this Free Syrian Army, within their conversation with the I think U.S. delegation at the time, because their country of asylum was supposed to be, or resettlement was supposed to be, the U.S. And in that interview, my interlocutor continued to tell me that they were extremely surprised when they told them that the faction of the Free Syrian Army, after 10 days of keeping this my informant, actually let them go. So they were arrested for 10 days, they were let go. And the question that they kept on asking in the interview, how did they actually let you go? You look extremely feminine, you look very gay. It cannot be that they actually let you go. It's impossible, looking as you are, that they didn't, it was very weird. This person's case was pending. They did not get resettled at the end. And, in that dynamic, of course, to my friend kept on telling them that, hey, they let me go because actually I was a Sunni. Because initially they thought I was an Alawite, and because I'm from Latakia, which means, people assume I'm with the regime and not against it. So, a lot of talking about Sunni and Alawite stuff, okay, then maybe you're actually not a threat. This person's queerness at that moment was less important than other factors that, if we diversify that kind of knowledge, it would actually, give, in that sense, way more gains, So a person who accidentally tells that their family loves them will probably never get asylum, because if your family loves you, how come you're actually, the family ostracization narrative has to work all the time. You have to mention that story. What if your family loves you? And I think, so a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people go in there not knowing that they have to filter their stories like that. I mean, this person who got kidnapped, that's a horrifying, suffering story. What more do you want? And that's where I don't just get it, like how things function in humanitarian spaces sometimes. So yes, a lot to gain in that sense, for sure. To come to the second question, also just very quickly, yes, of course, they're not, I mean, in the way I talk, of course, to say that they completely resemble global queer persecution imagery is an overstatement, of course, but also to say that they completely disappear. LGBTIQ narratives or stories are completely disappeared from the Syrian context. That's also an overstatement in that sense. So I get what you're getting at, for sure. But I would need more time to be able to tap into that kind of question, for sure, because as national subjects in Syria, and I will mention this very quickly, a part of my problem with some of the discourses now is that there's a lot of focus on thinking that you're only visible if you exist in writing, you're only visible if you exist in discourses, you're only visible if you exist in videos and images, and if you're eloquent and can express yourself in a certain way. And there, I just have my issue with appear, disappear, because of course I always think, we need a different way of articulating that. I need to work better on articulating that as well, because of course there was a lot of, at the same time, visibility in the Syrian public sphere prior to 2010. Of course, people were not always disappeared, and at the same time, people don't always resemble global queer persecution. That's a very easy way to put it. Of course, the dynamic is much more complex than this. And sorry, maybe I'll stop at that. with that kind of question. And last question. And what are the measures and specific issues queer Syrians have to face compared to the rest of the LGBTIQ community in the world? I will, again, keep it short and maybe say a couple of quick sentences. I think for the Syrian context, I don't want to say it makes them, we don't want to exceptionalize also in that sense, of course. Similarities are there, and things that cut across different national contexts are also there. But I think when I think of Syrian context, the war, the dynamic of the war for the last, and the conflicts for the last 11 years made the discussion, quite different about Syrian LGBTIQ people. The way, articulations of war and LGBTIQ people over the last 11 years, especially within, the largest or the biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II, and the most mediated, and I'm quoting some Donatella Del Rata, I think the name of the author is, as the most mediated conflict in history. I do think in that sense, there were some new, kind of more specific, different dynamics happening in the Syrian context in comparison to many other contexts in our modern times.
Yeah.
Do I have more?
Yeah, so thanks. We are quickly running out of time, but I'm going to read out the last two questions, and maybe you can say a few words. So one is by Rawan Arar. Hello, Rawan. She's saying, thank you for sharing your research and insights with us. I was wondering if you could reflect on the role of humanitarianism in representation. Also, could you recommend a couple of readings to the audience? And then the next question by Nesreen Chaer. Thanks for the amazing talk. Based on your work about Syrian trans histories, can you speak a bit about the limitations of transgender studies? I know that's a big question.
These are very both not small questions. Can I reflect very quickly on the role of humanitarianism in representation? So if I understand the question correctly, humanity, like how to represent, like in representation, how could we do humanitarian work in representation? How do we, I don't get the question.
Yeah, so maybe if you start with the second question, and then maybe Rawan can specify in comment. I mean, the way I would understand it is, I mean, your work shows how humanitarianism, very much shapes, well, the sort of representation of refugees, and then I guess also how refugees would represent themselves. I mean, that's how I understand the question.
Okay, that definitely, that makes sense. That's also a very big question. I mean, I have, my Queer Humanitarian Visibility article specifically answers this question, of how humanitarianism functions when it comes to representing as LGBTIQ, Syrian LGBTIQ refugees. I would recommend maybe that article for sure. But also my other articles, and also there's a lot of wealth of work on humanitarianism, and how it works in representation as well, thinking Didier Fassin, Didier Fassin's work is absolutely illuminating and great in that regard, and a bunch of other people. I will stop. And last 2 minutes, this means questions. So those based on your work about Syrian trans histories, can you speak a bit about the limitations of transgender studies? I think in my article on transgender studies as well, I do tackle that question a little bit. And yes, limitations of transgender studies. I think one of the maybe main, maybe two limitations. I think transgender studies has been generally a bit too allergic to anthropological inquiry. And I think, because of course, and rightfully so, also because of anthropology's colonial history, and because a lot of scholars just sometimes go into other contexts, or used to go into other contexts, romanticize a lot the experiences of transgender people in other cultures, so the transgender studies is quite cautious there. But I think we need to work more on that, because in certain contexts like Syria or in Lebanon, the Middle East, these contexts are horribly understudied, anthropologically, in terms of narrating personal experience. And the other issue, and maybe the other limitation I could think of is, yes, a lot of transgender, or what would count as trans experiences in the Syrian contexts or in the Middle Eastern contexts, a lot of them would still really, really not make a lot of sense in transgender studies. So a lot of them, they wouldn't make sense. They don't have a language for them that would make sense. A lot of things might even come off as offensive, as too strange, as even sometimes backwards. Of course, a word we're very careful to use here, as different ways of being transgender or being gender nonconforming, of different ways of being. A lot of them sometimes still do not make sense within transgender studies, and I think there's a lot of work to be done there, to include sometimes more or different ways of looking at things that are not always reduced to being called, false consciousness, or they don't know enough, or they're not educated enough around gender and sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the last thing I will say.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I mean, you covered a lot, and I really appreciate your sort of plug for the ethnographic, while also, of course, very much being aware of and trying to challenge the sort of historical pitfalls of ethnographic work, especially as it pertains to the Middle East, but also in many other contexts. And I think, that is so important, and also really appreciate your straddling, theorizing and contributing to theory, but also being very grounded and, being an activist. I mean, something that I really respect and appreciate. And I want to thank you for your time and for the work that you do. And I'm looking forward to following up your writings and, finding out what you're doing next. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining us. And I hope to be in contact and hopefully see each other in person in the not so far away future.
Hopefully in Berlin.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia, for this opportunity, and really thank you everyone who's been listening to us, and everybody who made this lecture today possible. Thank you so much. Have a great day and great evening.
Thank you.